Is there anyone? Okay. So this might be a little strange with me kind of periodically looking over here and then over here and then over here, but you know, we live in strange times, so it's all good. There are actually quite a few people online. Okay, so some of the online people are saying hi, everyone. The class says hello. This is weird. Oh. Some people are ill. That's why they're not in person. Yeah, I hope you get well soon, Katie. Elizabeth also. So, as I just said to the people in person, I'm going to be looking here, and it might be a bit weird, but hopefully everyone can hear me. And if someone from in the class has a question, I'll repeat it out loud so that you can hear. And you'll have to follow along the slides on your own. That's going to be a bit tricky, but right now we're on the first slide. So we're just going to get started, and we're talking about egos, bundles, and multiple selves. So this is really cool stuff right here. What role, if it plays a role, does what we call the self play in our conscious experience, right? The self. If you think about it, it's hard to conceive of there being any conscious experience without a self, right? That's kind of like what Descartes' whole epistemological bedrock, his cogito, is all about, right? I think, therefore I am. The existence of his self is something that he cannot doubt. And I have to admit, like, I have a similar feeling when I think about, you know, if I try for myself to doubt myself, that I exist, that just seems absurd, because, you know, I'm having an experience. Yes.
You're not capable of doubting yourself. Clearly, your childhood did not have enough gaslighting.
Exactly, right. You can doubt yourself as in, you know, your abilities or whatever, but can you doubt that you exist? I don't know. I find it's difficult until I got introduced to some of the theories that we'll talk about today, namely bundle theory. So it seems like there's this ego, or I, right, that has these experiences. And not only that, it's continuous. So we have a unified self, the ego, and its existence seems continuous over time, right? And we talk about selves all the time in everyday parlance, right? I was just doing that. We were just making jokes about it, right? So we can joke about self-doubt. We can talk about, you know, things we like ice cream, or music, or things we hate. Maybe you hate the smell of coffee. I don't know. So we have this seemingly unified and continuous self, but is that really what's happening? Is the self really unified and continuous, or is that an illusion? So the way we understand ourselves as these sort of unified, continuous entities comes naturally to us. But if you think about it, in fact, the more you think about it, the more problematic this notion of the self seems to be, right? But that doesn't mean that, you know, this is some kind of a, you know, this is widespread. This is a widespread way of thinking of the self, right? I mentioned Descartes. So in rationalist philosophy, we have Descartes, whose ego sort of forms the foundations of what he can know, his inability to doubt the existence of his self. And Descartes was, of course, educated in not only law and math, but he was also a Jesuit. So he's like a philosopher priest, if you like, right? So, and what kind of priest? Well, the Jesuit tradition comes from Catholicism. So he's basically trained in Catholic theology. So he's coming from a Christian perspective. And of course, in religions like Christianity and Islam, the self is often equated with the soul, right? Yes.
Is this related to the fact that like, if I do something bad and then like 10 years in the future, I regret those things, like in the Christian faith, I would have still sinned. Meanwhile, to myself personally, I don't even view that as the same person. And so
Yeah.
I'm just very not religious. And so like experiencing the self as continuous as like a natural thing for the religion also seems to fall in with like the understanding of linear kind of behavior and then like ending up in heaven, at least I think I understand.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that highlights the continuous part, right?
Okay.
Of unified and continuous. Exactly. Like you're and maybe you remember from your class for Minds and Machines last semester, that you know, self, soul, mind are all sort of, at least in many traditions, taken to be that thing that makes us human, that makes us have moral responsibility. It's the thing that makes us special, right? It's the thing that, you know, if you're a Christian or if you're a Muslim, you believe that the soul is really your primordial self. It's what's really you, right? And this world is just a test or something, right? But not so in Buddhism. Buddhism is an interesting exception to religions that sort of talk about what we could characterize as ego theory, the idea of a unified and continuous self. We'll call that ego theory, but we'll get to that in a moment. Buddhism's a little different, right? In Buddhism, firstly, was founded by this sort of prince turned ascetic, Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, right? He became the enlightened one. And he challenged this view. He challenged ego theory with a doctrine called anatta or anatman. It depends whether you're talking in Sanskrit or Pali, but both terms mean no self. So on Buddhism, the self is a label that we give to something that's actually not unified and continuous. So on Buddhism, the self is an illusion. And it's probably the only major religion that teaches this, which is interesting. And of course, the ancient Greeks, they had problems with their notion of the self, and that stems from how they thought of the soul. So problems for the unified self pop up for Greek thinkers, because Greek thinkers, Plato here, but also Aristotle, thought of the soul as divisible. They thought there were parts of soul, right? Plato thought that there was a rational soul, your mind, your intellect, but also a spirited soul, which is like your emotions, and an appetitive soul, which is basic drives, you know, hunger, thirst, sexual desire, and those kinds of things. Similarly, Aristotle has a rational soul. He thinks of humans possessing a rational soul, as well as a vegetative soul or a nutritive soul. This is the soul that's responsible for growth, reproduction, eating, you know, consuming nutriment. And there's also the sensitive soul for Aristotle. The sensitive soul is how we perceive and move about in the world. But how can it all be the soul if it's divisible, right? Plato thought the soul was immortal. Aristotle probably didn't. But this is probably a bigger problem for Plato because he wants to argue that the soul is immortal. It survives death. Well, which part? All the parts or just the rational soul? Probably just the rational soul. That's my understanding when I read Plato, but I don't know. We can't exactly ask him now, can we? So what are you going to do? So it seems like I'm a unified self and that I continually exist, but why does it seem this way? One answer is that that's really the way it is. I really do have a unified, continuously existing self. That's really what I am. But the alternative answer is that this is merely an illusion. we have a self. Remember, illusions are not things that don't exist. Illusions are things that are not the way they appear to be. So I have a self, but it's not unified and continuous. Whatever the self is, it's not an ego, right? And the philosopher, Derek Parfit, who I believe recently passed away a few years ago now, called each of these two views ego theory and bundle theory. Ego theory for the view that the self is continually existing over time and unified. And bundle theory, well, we'll see in a moment, but bundle theory really says that the self is not unified and continuous, but is a bundle of ideas, experiences, something that's kind of always there, but always changing, never the same from moment to moment, that kind of thing. So as I mentioned earlier, oh, Zoe, go ahead.
Sorry, there was bundle theory, and what was the other one?
Ego theory.
Oh,
yeah.
It's on the slide.
Yeah, no worries. So ego theories, as I was kind of alluding to before, are the most popular type of theory, right? Major religions like Christianity and Islam, as I mentioned before. Judaism too. You have a soul, right? And the self is the soul. As I mentioned, Buddhism is probably the one major exception to this. And, you know, we've got lots of other philosophers who are ego theorists, like Rene Descartes, like, I think, probably most modern Western philosophers, really, but not David Hume, which we'll get to in a moment. Why is this? Why is this view so natural to us? Well, let's turn from philosophy to psychology. We know, because psychologist Paul Bloom has done some experiments with children, and he's found that young children, we're talking, you know, 5 to 6, or maybe a bit younger, see the world in terms of two domains, right? Bodies and souls. When children grow a little older, when they reach 5 to 6 years old, they start to think of the brain as, quote, a tool we use for certain mental operations, a cognitive prosthesis added to the soul. So we have a body and a soul. We have dualism, right? And we've already talked about dualism to a great extent in this class, right? But mind or souls, as opposed to the body, dualism. Even children that are as young as 4 years old understand that death means the cessation of biological functions. Yet, as they get older, they begin to separate biological functions, say breathing, from psychological functions. And some older children, and adults too, will even attribute beliefs, desires, and emotions to the dead. But interestingly, the older children and adults don't attribute perceptions to the dead. Interesting, right? Yes.
So to clarify, this could be like somebody who has died, referring them in the present tense, like Mary likes the color red, but not that like Mary has seen anything.
Yeah, kind of like, you know, when people talk about how a relative would be proud of a living person.
Yeah. Okay.
Kind of like that kind of thing. But I don't know, this perceptions, I mean, people talk about dead people looking down from heaven and whatnot, right? So I don't really know. I'd be curious to see what exact questions Bloom was using here. I'm also not religious, so like, I don't know when people say that, when somebody is looking down from heaven, I don't know whether they understand that to mean that somebody is literally seeing you from above or what, right? Yeah.
Like from someone from like a very religious like place, it can mean either or. It really depends on the person, and like especially in like the rural US where you have a lot of like Protestant denominations that are based on like an individual like, conception of like relationship to God.
Oh,
Like there's a lot of variation because of just that doctrine of like people can draw their own conclusions.
right,
So
right.
you can't like you can't really make a sweeping statement one way or the other. I don't know if it would change in the more like sort of institutionalized religions, but in my experience, it's very variable.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it would depend then on, well, it could depend on any number of things, but yeah, the nature of which religious sort of environment we're talking about. What else? There's another study that was done that I just kind of mentioned because I don't know if it's relevant, but another study that was done by Dan Wegner and Kurt Gray on attributions of things like animacy, whether something is alive or not. And interestingly, in the same way that Bloom finds that people attribute beliefs and desires and emotions to the dead, but not perceptions, Gray and Wegner found that people attribute a lot of agency to God, but not experience, which is also kind of weird if you think about it. Like, so maybe something's going on here where if you stop and ask somebody, they give you one answer, but in terms of what they actually do, right, in terms of religious practice or personal expression of personal beliefs, maybe there's two different things going on there. I'm not sure. But Bloom's work explains very nicely why, potentially anyway, why ego theory is so prevalent. We seem to grow up as ego theorists. And this is all animacy. I talk about animacy and animism a lot in my classes and in my work. But here we're really talking about seeing the world as a place that's quite literally alive, right? And there's lots of different versions of this. The ancient Greeks were animists, right? Often we talk about them in terms of polytheism, and that's true. But you know, every tree had a spirit living in it, right? Every fountain, everything you could possibly imagine had some god or spirit associated with it. Yes.
Well, even religious beliefs that we don't like associate directly with like polytheism per se can have the same things. Like I believe Shintoism is a similar.
Yeah, Shinto is probably the most, I would say, famous example of an animistic religion nowadays that people can point to.
Like the point is you don't have to strictly be like a polytheistic like religion to have some of the same.
Yeah, exactly. It's just that I think polytheistic religions tend to have that. But you know, it's really just a matter of semantics. But this is interesting, and this has been noted by other thinkers too. Like I don't talk about Freud too much in this class, but Freud famously, you know, kind of says the same thing. I mean, children easily imagine that their toys are alive. He thinks it's all because of like psychoanalytic reasons. Those are not the explanations we accept today, but still, yes.
So if there was like a child who had difficulty like animating their toys and stuff like that, or like if there was a child that, for instance, if somebody died, if they saw a dead animal, they didn't understand that the dead body was once alive, what would the kind of argument be there? Would it be that like they're fundamentally developing differently, or just that they have a different philosophical background?
I would say that they're probably developing differently, but yeah, go ahead.
Sociopaths as well, like not being able to like things outside of your own self.
For psychopathy, yeah, there's a deficit in certain kinds of empathy. And empathy is something that kind of develops on top of like shared attention. Like if I can follow someone's intentional behavior, you know, I don't know, maybe I'm a little kid and my mom is making breakfast and I can like watch, right? Like, oh, the hand is grabbing this thing, which flips the egg. So I can see what's up, right? And as we grow older, we learn to use things like eye contact, you know, say like I'll make eye contact with this guy to see what he's doing so that he knows that I'm trying to look at what he's doing, whatever it is, some task. And this makes sense because we're social beings and we need to coordinate our behavior. So in psychopathy, there are certain deficits in empathy, like certain kinds. Psychopaths can, for example, still read minds reasonably well, but say have difficulty feeling compassion for somebody, right? Which is why they might manipulate you or how they might manipulate you. Similarly, people on the autism spectrum will have certain deficits in that shared attention stuff I was talking about. And that's why play in autistic children is different from play in neurotypical children. They won't, for example, pretend their car is alive.
Yeah, that's
But
what
they
I
might like to
experienced.
arrange their cars in a nice, orderly way, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's a different kind of play, a different way of engaging with the world, right? So I think it's definitely developmental. I think a philosophical outlook doesn't come until we're much older,
Yeah.
maybe until, at least not until we're angsty teenagers, right? And then maybe we start thinking about stuff. But yeah, for the most part, when we're young, I think that it's fair to say most of us are ego theorists, right? We equate the mind with, which is non-physical, we equate the mind to the self. Or if you're brought up in perhaps a religious setting, perhaps you equate the mind to the soul, right? And that's certainly what Descartes' substance dualism is all about, right? We have, on Descartes' view, we have res extensa, which is matter, stuff, physical stuff that takes up space, and res cogitans, thinking substance, the substance of the soul. But he's not the only one. Karl Popper and is it John Eccles? I can never remember. But their dualist interactionism theory. It's, well, as the name says, dualist. It kind of proposes that there is it's a strange, it's kind of a weird take on things. But yeah, I guess if you adhere to Popper and Eccles' dualist interactionist theory, whatever it is that's able to interact with the physical brain must be a unified and continuous self, even though they don't exactly explain what that means. But that aside, we should make sure not to falsely equivocate between ego and bundle theorists on the one hand and dualism and materialism on the other hand. You could be an ego theorist and still be a materialist. And you could be a bundle theorist, I suppose, and perhaps still be a dualist. So they're not mutually exclusive. So that's ego theory. What about bundle theory? Bundle theories are not quite as popular as ego theory, but they do have their share, or rather bundle theory has its share of famous advocates, right? Parfit, of course, describes the Buddha as the first bundle theorist because of his doctrine of no self. But bundle theory, actually, the term actually comes from the work of David Hume. So in A Treatise of Human Nature, Hume argues that what the self is not a unified and continuously existing entity, but rather a bundle of different perceptions. They succeed one another very, very rapidly, such that it seems like the self is unified and continuous, but this is really just an illusion. So on bundle theory, all of our ideas, all of the things that we sense, all our sense impressions and perceptions and whatnot seem unified because of the relationship between our experiences and our memories of our experiences. So there's all kinds of things happening all the time, things happening to us, things that we remember, we recollect. It seems to us that we are a unified and continuous self, but we're actually not. There's no unified entity to whom these experiences actually happen. This reminds me of the idea of the protean self. I forget the name of the psychologist who came up with this term, but Proteus was a shapeshifter from ancient Greek mythology, right? So The protean self is meant to sort of exemplify how you may think you are still you now compared to when you were, say, I don't know, 5 years old, but clearly you are different, right? Like, am I the same self I was last year or 10 years ago or when I was a young child? I don't think I'm the same self. I still feel like me. Okay. Yeah, sorry, we lost internet, everybody, but I'm back. So sorry about that. Okay, so back to bundle theory. Hume writes, for my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. So Hume is saying, like, look, when I think about it, when I introspect, all I can see is some memory or some perception, but not a me. He can't perceive a me or an I or an ego in the same way that he can recall and perceive a memory or perceive, you know, some sense perception that's happening in the world right now. Yes.
So does that feel like a materialist approach in that case? Because what you're seeing, the only thing that's perception, which is just something that your body feels, not something that yourself will be doing.
I'm not sure. See, yeah, I'm really not sure. I don't think.
Like when he says he doesn't see the self,
Yeah.
that means like he's not seeing anything extra. It's all just him doing those body actions, not seeing anybody doing those things.
Yeah. I suppose I want to say that he is kind of a materialist, because he's also, you know, an atheist. He's doubting the existence of the self. But I'm never sure. I kind of like to make the comparison between this and what Dennett says about the self as a sort of narrative center of gravity, right? It's there, but it's not like a tangible thing. It's something abstract that I guess your memories and perceptions kind of orbit around, if you want to put it like that. That's sort of the lens through which I read this, but I don't know if Hume would disagree with how I'm interpreting it, right? But he does conclude that whatever the self is, it's not unified and continuous, right? It's always just a bundle.
So like would the appearance of self kind of be like that whole like orbit, like that gravitational pull is basically just a basic function, like all of these things are a function, all of these things are happening. They're not driven by one thing, but in the order that they're all happening, it's all like coming out to one outcome, which is existence.
Yeah, like it's a story that your brain is telling.
Yeah.
You
are the main thing.
Yeah, you're like the main character in the story that your brain puts together for you. Right. You know, rather than like, you know, you're not the pilot and the robot, to use the Cartesian materialism analogy, right? Yeah. In that way, you could say the self is fictional, which I think is also maybe something that, yeah, like, because what does it mean when something's fictional? I can still talk about fictional characters, right? I can still say that, you know, Sherlock Holmes's arch enemy is Professor Moriarty, and you all know what I'm talking about. But these things aren't real, but I can still talk about them. Maybe the self is like that. I don't know. But yeah, so Hume concludes there's no self. But Thomas Reid, another Scottish philosopher, counters Hume. He appeals to ego theory, and he says, I am not thought, I am not action, I am not feeling, I am something which thinks and acts and feels, right? Sounds like Descartes. Yes?
If the concept of self is not dissimilar to that of like a fictional character, that might explain some of the like tendencies we have when it comes to telling stories. That we like stories that focus on individual people, people we can relate to, because it's, you know, on some level similar to the way that like we constructed our own like sense of self.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, like we empathize with characters that are like how we see.
In addition, the capacity to write characters that are essentially self-insert of how the author sees themselves is like, you know, also an application.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's pretty cool. Yeah, cool observation. So just to get back to this point, this thing, I am something. This is really the key difference, I think, between ego and bundle theory. And on ego theory, there's a thing, right? The ego is the thing. A thinking thing if you're Descartes, or a thinking and acting thing if you're Reid, right? But whether we're looking at bundle theory or a sort of fictional self theory, there is no thing, no ego like that, right? And these two theories capture a fundamental difference in terms of the way people think about what the self is, right? So ego theorists, remember, they believe the self is continually existing through time and that it's unified. So the self is what does everything. It's the origin of your thoughts. It's the origin of your actions, of your feelings, all of that stuff. And this view of the self seems to accord with our experience, right? But bundle theorists deny this. And maybe this can be hard to think about. I mean, how, you know, people say that, or at least some people say that the idea of the self as a unified and continuously existing entity accords with experience. But does it really? Like, when I think about it, the only time it actually does accord with experience is when I'm thinking about it, right? If I sit down and meditate a little bit like Descartes, and I think like, well, what is the self? Well, I shall sit down here and think about the self, you know, and I seem to be like putting my ego theorist hat on when I do that. But in my day-to-day life, I mean, how conscious am I at any point in my day-to-day life? When I was on my way up here and I was just kind of looking out the window of the vehicle that I was traveling in, just kind of like, and then all of a sudden I'm here. Where was myself then? I certainly didn't feel like a unified, continuously existing self when I was spacing out, looking out the window of the Uber or whatever, right? And this is why Blackmore has these little exercises kind of throughout the book, like how conscious are you right now? I mean, now that we're back in person, it would be really good to sort of emphasize that these are good exercises to do, right? How conscious are you right now versus before the class began? These are good things to reflect on. But bundle theorists, right? Okay, so back to bundle theory. Bundle theorists deny there is a self, and this is hard to contemplate. The idea that selves are an illusion, that the self that we think exists doesn't exist, right? But we should try. There are some compelling reasons to doubt that whether the self is, you know, actually unified and continuously existing. One of them is this interesting phenomenon, this interesting medical disorder called dissociative identity disorder, which is exceedingly rare, by the way. This is not a commonly occurring thing. The first case that we know of happened, I believe, in New York. I believe Mr. Ansel Bourne, who was a preacher, I believe he lived in New York. I could be wrong about that. I don't quite remember, but he disappeared in January in 1887. He disappeared and he wasn't heard from again for months. But 2 weeks after his disappearance, there was an A.J. Brown who showed up in Pennsylvania, and he opened up a little shop. He would get all his supplies brought in. It was like a general store, you know, a 19th century general store. On March 14th, Mr. Brown wakes up in his bedroom in his shop to a terrible fright. He doesn't know where he is. Oh, I don't know where I am. And people are like, Mr. Brown, what's wrong? Mr. Brown, what? My name is Ansel Bourne. He wakes up again as Ansel Bourne. And soon after, oh, it says right there, Rhode Island. So not New York, he's from Rhode Island. So they take him back home to Rhode Island. And this is the first case of what was then called multiple personality disorder. Now we call this dissociative identity disorder. It's exceedingly rare, very rare. Early attempts at treating it were, you know, perhaps not the best approaches. Some approaches included, for example, hypnosis or psychoanalysis. So on hypnosis, the idea is to try to, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but you can read about this in the book. Hypnosis would be used to reach the other people, the other selves, you know, so maybe the psychologist would or psychiatrist would hypnotize you and say, I need to talk to Mr. Brown now. So Mr. Bourne, can I talk to Mr. Brown? You see this in fictionalized depictions of multiple personality disorder. And psychoanalysis, the whole idea behind psychoanalysis was that you want to have a unified psyche. Obviously, if you've got multiple personalities, your psyche can't be unified. So we got to do some psychoanalysis. Ben has a question, and also there's some questions in the chat, which I'll get to. But Ben, go ahead.
So I was just wondering, because in the book, it talks about how the doctor reported that the hypnosis like worked. So like, do you think that's actually true, or do you think that's like him making it up?
Well, we're not sure. Hypnosis is interesting. Hypnosis is a thing. Like a lot of people think that it's fakery. Hypnosis can't, like people can actually be hypnotized, some of them. We don't exactly know what exactly is going on though. And so I'm not sure how to evaluate this. But like Elizabeth says in the chat, like, is it genetic? Danica asks if it could be environmental. Both of these probably play a large role in all mental illness. It's always some combination of genetic and environmental factors. And if that's the case, I have to wonder how effective hypnosis would be at treating this kind of thing. I have to admit that I'm actually not that certain what the treatment would be now if one had if one is diagnosed with multiple personality disorder, right? But it does seem to be comorbid with other psychiatric factors, other psychiatric disorders. And one big thing seems to be trauma, right? So I don't know. I'm not sure if that answers Ben's and Elizabeth's and Danica's questions, but hopefully it provides some clarification. But yeah, comorbidities are high. I'd say it probably has, as is the case with a lot of mental illness, can be rooted in a traumatic event, often misrepresented in fiction. You know, I don't know. What are some examples of good and bad, potentially good and bad depictions of dissociative identity disorder? Yes.
Isn't there like the movie Split?
Yeah.
I heard of that one. That's M. Night Shyamalan, right?
Yeah, there's Unbreakable, Mr. Glass, and Split.
That's a trilogy. Yeah. I haven't seen, I started to watch Unbreakable, but I couldn't finish it. I don't know.
Superhero costume.
Yeah.
I don't know. Unbreakable was like an okay twist, but I didn't like Mr. Glass or I actually have fibromyalgia.
Oh, okay. So, yeah.
or Mr. Split, but yeah, Mr. Split definitely was like a bad one because they did like the hypnotism and the naming stuff. And like part of it was they were trying to say that like it was misunderstood and that he was mistreated, and that's why he was so like off the deep end. But then also they portrayed him as just being completely off the deep end.
Huh.
With like no redeeming traits.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, could I go see something?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah. Don't worry. You don't have to ask me. You can, if anyone needs to move around at any point, it's all good. A very famous example. What's that? Oh, Jekyll and Hyde is yeah, and that's mentioned by Blackmore, but I wouldn't say that that's, I mean, didn't Dr. Jekyll make something that would turn him into Mr. Hyde?
Yeah.
I think it was like, if I recall correctly, it was like, he already had like those like impulses, and it was just a thing that would like effectively turn him into a different person. So
Yeah.
act on those impulses.
Like the Incredible Hulk,
Yeah.
you know, same idea. No, what I'm thinking of is Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock,
Okay.
right? Norman Bates.
Yeah.
Norman Bates also thinks he is his mother. And yeah, that was one of the main themes in that movie. Maybe not the best portrayal of multiple personality disorder, but it is a classic one. One that I also really enjoy, and I don't know who, Billy Milligan, Danica says he had DID and had different personalities commit crimes. Is that a real person?
Yeah, it's a real person. He committed rapes in the States in the 70s. There was a Netflix documentary, and then I went down the rabbit hole.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Fascinating. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So that's disturbing. But yeah, okay. So I was going to say that at least as far as fictional portrayals go, an interesting one is also Mr. Robot, if anyone has seen that. That's an interesting one, but I'll leave it there. So I do want to focus on some split brain stuff before we have to wrap up, but dissociative identity disorder is really interesting for people who are interested in this kind of thing, right? I mean, cases like the ones we've been talking about, or take a real one like Billy Milligan mentioned by Danica, certainly seems to suggest that the self is not, or at least some of the time not, sorry about the typo there, unified and continuous. You know, there's also an idea of a fugue, the idea of the fugue state where you lose time. It's not quite like this. I guess if you have dissociative identity disorder, then for whenever you are not yourself and you're one of the other personalities, yourself is in that fugue state. But you can also just have a fugue state where you lose time and don't remember anything. And maybe you weren't some other personality at that point, right?
Can I confirm, I spent a weekend, October 2020, in a state very similar to that, where it was just like, I was just out of it.
Wow.
Like, I was like, I know I was conscious the entire time, but it was like, I remember very little. And the one thing I distinctly remember was I broke myself out of it because it was cold that Sunday, and I went for a walk without a jacket on. And it was like the really intense sensation of the cold on my body was what like brought me back to like the present.
Interesting.
But yeah, from what I understand, it can be caused by other things. Like it's kind of similar to like dissociation. Like it's just that sort of like altered, you know, like experience of what's going on.
Yeah.
I've done it during an exam. I sat down, we have like an hour to write the exam. I looked at the paper and then I looked back up and the exam time is over and I've not even written my name yet.
Wow. Yeah. It's how I am. I mean, I've never experienced anything like this, but I imagine it must be like if you fall asleep for a little bit and wake up. Like I used to have in high school, I used to have quite a long bus ride because we lived in the country and I had to go all the way into town. So it's like over an hour on the school bus every day. It sucked. But sometimes I could catch a bit of a nap on the way in. And sometimes I would find that you know, I would be just leaving my stop and kind of nod off and then whoop, and I'm at school, right? I imagine it must be like that, like when you literally lose consciousness, or like when you go to the dentist and they put you under, you know, you
Feels like time travel.
yeah, like you're gone, you're just in the future all of a sudden. It's pretty cool, but yeah. So this is interesting. The fugue state as well as DID kind of undermines our notion of the unified and continuous self. And you know, people who undergo both of these things, as we were just saying, can experience depersonalization. You know, things feel less real. They can lose time. Sometimes, and again, you can read this in the book, certain selves have access to the original's memories, but not other times. There's an interesting case of that Blackmore discusses. So what do we do with all of this? You know, how do we make fugue states and dissociative identity disorder make sense? Well, if these things are real phenomena, then Blackmore argues it would suggest that ego theory is false, right? At least in cases of dissociative identity disorder, selves are not unified and continuously existing entities, right? Or maybe there aren't really multiple selves, but multiple aspects of one self. Maybe that's what we're seeing. That would still fit with bundle theory. And it would still seem to suggest that ego theory is false. Ben, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to bring up that in some of the examples, like the one with the lady, I forgot her name, but she, like, one of her selves knew about the other self, but then the one self didn't know about the. So like there is some where they're like knowledgeable about each other.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and I can't remember her name either, but you're right. And I think everybody should, if they're curious, just have a read through this chapter again. And there is a woman with multiple selves whose original self doesn't know what the other selves are up to, but the other selves know what the original is up to. And they'll do things like smoke cigarettes, even though the original self doesn't smoke. And they'll smoke a cigarette to upset the original self. It's so weird. But it also, you know, dissociative identity disorder might not be a distinct disorder in its own right. There are other similar disorders where you kind of get a sort of fragmented self, right? Schizophrenia is interesting because in schizophrenia, people have this this sensation. If you're schizophrenic, you might have this sensation that you are not the originator of your thoughts or actions, right? Borderline personality disorder. Here we're talking about emotional extremes, not quite like bipolar disorder, where you're going from manic to depressive, but just sort of like extreme emotions, such that maybe somebody doesn't seem like themselves if they're going through, if they're having some kind of episode, right? Yeah.
Would another example of this be like examples of like age regression or PTSD flashbacks? Because like somebody who has age regression, they're going to regress back to a specific time in their life, or like somebody with PTSD flashbacks, they're going to go back to that time and experience.
Yeah.
And so they're like almost experiencing a different version of their self at that time.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that, but that's an interesting point. I have to think about that.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a good point. And
Well, wouldn't that prove the self is continuous because revisiting your own memory would be your
Well,
revisiting your memory?
I don't know, because like I don't see past versions of myself as the same person. No.
There's a difference in perception there.
Yeah, so like I guess visiting my own memories would be like visiting something, and like I can understand that I'm the same person, but just I did very different things for very different reasons. You know, I was an 8-year-old kid who did 8-year-old kid things.
yeah, I guess, yeah. Some of this is semantics and some of this is fundamentally different outlooks,
Yeah,
right? And it's
yeah.
hard to disentangle, right? But go
I
ahead.
think part of the problem is like if I had to, I kind of think that regardless of what, like, which theory is like more like accurate, I think both of them, like the sense of self is very context driven. And so, and in that light, it makes sense that people would come to very different conclusions, like, you know, thinking about the same idea, because if their sense of self is informed by very different contexts.
That's true, right? Just to use the PTSD example, how would, I mean, maybe somebody who we can safely characterize as an ego theorist, maybe they're a religious or something, might try and deal with the causes of that, like the root of the trauma, the thing that resulted in PTSD, differently than somebody who's, say, a philosophy major who is a bundle theorist, right?
An example I just came up with is like, let's say that like something that you've eaten fairly often for the rest of your life is like, you know, couscous. And one day you were served couscous with your meal while you have the stomach flu, and now you associate it with having the stomach flu. You could either interpret that as being your sense of self has remained constant the whole time and is now just informed by the addition of that experience, or your sense of self is like, you know, the bundle theory, and you added a different set of information to like that collection.
Yeah.
Like you could take that either way, which is why I think it's probably the reason why people come to different conclusions.
Yeah, fair enough. But maybe there's other lines of evidence that we can look at besides things that are subjective, right? Like split brain patients. This is cool. So when you have multiple personality disorder, or even one of the other interesting disorders that we were talking about, the brain is intact, but you still have this dissociative thing happening. But in split brain cases, there's dissociations, but it's a result of actually splitting the brain, right? This is not done that often anymore, but it used to be that in certain cases of epilepsy, the recommended treatment would be to cut the corpus callosum. Now, the brain, of course, as you may know, has two hemispheres, right? The left and the right hemisphere. And the corpus callosum is this sort of bridge between the two hemispheres. It allows each hemisphere to exchange information with the other hemisphere. The reason why we sometimes do this in cases of epilepsy is because if you have a seizure that maybe starts in one hemisphere, it can actually spread to the other hemisphere, causing a seizure throughout the entire brain. But if we have severe seizures going on like this and we cut the corpus callosum, then the seizures can't spread. And people usually live a much better life as a result of this. Sometimes we do the entire corpus callosum, sometimes it's only partial. Yeah.
Are there any side effects other than seizures?
There are side effects.
Like less seizures?
Yes. Yes. Oh, that's what we're about to talk about. Yeah, there's some weird side effects, really weird side effects. But to understand them, we need to understand that the brain is organized contralaterally. So here's an image that kind of depicts what that means. So contralateral organization of the brain means that, you know, if we're talking about the visual field, for example, information in your right visual field, which is over here, goes and is processed on the left side of the brain, in the visual cortex. From the left visual field is processed in the right visual cortex. And note, this is not like the left eye is processed on the right side and the input from the right eye is processed on the other side. No, it's visual fields. So you can see that here, the way this is illustrated. Moreover, motor control on the right side of the body is initiated on the left side of the brain, right here in the sensory motor cortex, and left movements initiated on the right side. The exception is auditory information. If I hear something in my left ear, it really is processed on the auditory cortex on my left side, and likewise with the right side, which makes sense, I suppose. But everything else is contralateral. That means that, you know, one of the things the corpus callosum is doing is sharing information between the two hemispheres. My information from my right visual field has to get to my left occipital lobe somehow. So corpus callosum, right? So there's some really weird things that happen that we find when we do experiments with split brain patients. We might do an experiment like this, where we have a participant with a split brain sit in front of a screen, and the screen is divided in two, so that it's divided so that there's the left and right visual field. And there's a little fixation point in the middle, a little cross usually. And the experimenter will flash stimuli on either visual field so it reaches the opposite hemisphere. It won't reach both hemispheres because we're talking about split brain patients, right? I mean, if I'm holding this phone, my phone, someone holds my phone in my right visual field, it's still going primarily to my occipital lobe on the left side, but it also gets processed on the right side because of the corpus callosum, right? So I could still, identify this in either visual field if I wanted to. So it's happening differently here because split brain patients have their corpus callosum cut. So stimuli are flashed to either visual field, meaning that the stimuli only reaches the opposite hemisphere and not both. And they have to answer what the object is, either verbally, or they might point to a picture, or they might press a button. So an image is flashed to the right visual field. Flash. Now, most people's verbal processing areas are actually located in the left hemisphere. So the patient can then say what the item is, right? My verbal centers, I'm right-handed, so my verbal centers are probably in my left side. So, if I have this phone in my right visual field over here, no problem, right? It's contralateral. It's going over there to my left side, and that's where my verbal center is. No big deal. But if it was flashed, let's see. I'm always get confused with this contralateral organization stuff. So it's in the left hemisphere. But if I flash it on the wrong side of space, say I'm a split brain patient and I flash the stimulus over here. Well, it's going to go to my right visual cortex. But because my corpus callosum is cut, that information is not going to make it to the language centers in the left side of my brain. So I cannot say what that item is. I can see it, but I won't be able to identify it, right? So these are some of the interesting side effects, right, that we were talking about earlier. There's more examples too, right? If there's a pile of objects sort of out of sight in the left-hand side of space, then the patient can retrieve an item that was flashed using their left hand. They can even do tasks simultaneously. Like if I flash a stimulus to this side, my left hand can go and grab the object that was presented, likewise on the right side. But when split brain patients have to examine or explain what they're doing, they often confabulate because they actually don't really know what objects they're going for in every case, because the information is not being shared across the whole brain. So a patient might report that she saw a bottle because that's what one hemisphere saw, but she's retrieved a hammer with the other hand because that's what the other hemisphere saw, but she's not aware of that, right? It's all very strange, right? In one experiment, for example, they would flash a $sign to the left and a question mark to the right. And then they asked the patient to draw what they saw. They reported that they drew a question mark, but they actually drew the $sign. So it's like neither hemisphere is aware of what the other one is doing. It's really weird, right? And this is confabulating, right? When we ask people, why did you do that? They either get it wrong or they make up an explanation. I think there's, I don't have, oh yeah, we'll get to the confabulation in a moment. I have the example ahead. on a few slides. But, you know, as I was paraphrasing Sperry there, oh, actually, Ben has a question. Go ahead, Ben.
So like I'm a drummer, and one of the things that you learn like when you're drumming is like the independence of all your limbs. So you kind of have to like isolate, you know, different limbs so that they don't affect each other so you play different rhythms. And I was just wondering, do you think that relates to like obviously your brain isn't split, but is like a different hand in one side of the brain and different hand in the other?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the motor outputs would still be organized contralaterally. So, you know, say let's see if I remember drums. So my right hand is going to have the stick that hits the hi-hat, and my left hand's going to hit the snare. But my left hand is actually controlled by my right hemisphere, and my right hand controlled by my left hemisphere. And likewise for the feet. It's kind of like the somatosensory cortex would be, I can't really, I can't, it's hard to describe exactly where my hand is right now, but yeah, kind of like on the top, on either side, going down on the top of your head. If you can imagine that your brain is exposed, it would be like here, right? And this side is controlling all this, and this is controlling all this. But yeah, of course, with drumming and with keeping limb motion independent, I mean, that's also a matter of practice. How it would be affected by split brain stuff is very interesting, but I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure how it would be affected, right? But oh right. So where were we? So as I was paraphrasing Sperry, yeah, it's kind of like neither hemisphere in these split brain cases knows what the other one's doing. And Sperry actually argued that this demonstrated a sort of doubling of conscious awareness. So it's like two consciousnesses. He wrote, each hemisphere seemed to have its own separate and private sensations. And he concluded that, quote, the minor hemisphere constitutes a second conscious entity that is characteristically human and runs along in parallel with the more dominant stream of consciousness in the major hemisphere. And Christoph Koch agrees with this too. He says that, quote, split brain patients harbor two conscious minds in their two brain halves. Weird. He wonders further, quote, how does it feel to be the mute hemisphere permanently encased in one skull in the company of a dominant sibling that does all the talking? I don't know. Yeah.
I was wondering, like, if you could count those then two sides of the brain as like legally distinct selves. I mean, I can't think of any cases, but like imagine like a crime or a fine being perpetrated and arguing, oh, well, it wasn't the left side, it was the right side.
Right, like similar to the Billy Mulligan case, right?
Yeah, and it makes it very interesting because in like the realm of legal, you can't punish somebody like that because that would be unfair punishment to the innocent party. But
yeah, the thing is with split brain patients is one hemisphere is always going to be silent, right?
Mhm.
Because you only have a verbal center in one side. If you're right-handed, chances are it's on the left. If you're left-handed, chances are it's on the right.
If there was a case where like, because I know this has happened like very rarely before, but being born split brain, some people develop language processing centers on both sides of their brain. There's often like typical other difficulties there, but I don't know. It's very curious to think about, and it's just one of those things where like it hasn't happened yet, but it could be technically a legal possibility.
I'm not really sure. Yeah, it's hard because like you say, there hasn't really been a case of
yeah, exactly.
You know, and I'm also like, what would the crime be? Like, you know, because the things that are coming out in behavior are things like, you know, picking a thing where you think it's a different thing.
Yeah.
Right. So like
that the only thing I can come up with is like shoplifting, and at that point, it's not like it's a oops kind of thing. So.
But maybe with anarchic hand syndrome and alien hand syndrome, we're going to talk about those. Maybe maybe there's something there. So you go ahead, and then I'll have Ben go ahead on the computer.
So the split brain person commits a robbery or something like that. wouldn't, like, in order to carry it out, would you not have to collaborate with both sides of your brain in order to function, making it accomplice? Like, not completely innocent, because like, it's not like you're gonna rob a store completely seeing out of one field of vision and kind of just like purposefully like, oh, I'm gonna go commit a crime right now. I'm trying to ignore the other half of the brain. So like, the act of doing something requires both hemispheres of the brain. I know this is a crazy hypothetical.
Yeah,
but
it's a crazy hypothetical, but no, that's a funny point. Yeah, like there could be a case, I suppose, if I don't know why, what crime one could be committing, but maybe the silent hemisphere would be an accomplice.
Yeah.
We'd never know. We'd have to get it to like point to,
That's true.
right?
Ouija board, this
Right,
is-
yeah. And we are gonna, Ouija board is gonna come up in more self
The
stuff
major
later.
hemisphere commits a crime and their punishment is become the minor hemisphere.
Yeah.
Oh, that's dystopian.
Yeah. Ben, go ahead.
Well, I know this is kind of different, but there was a legal case recently where like a guy was murdered on a bus, and like the guy who killed him was like under the influence of psychosis.
Yeah,
And
I
he
remember
actually-
this.
Yeah, and he actually never got jail time because they determined that like they didn't have the mens rea or whatever.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean that might be comparable, because maybe if you have some sort of mental illness like that, they might, look at it the same way. But I mean, obviously it's different.
Exactly. Yeah. But that in that particular case, I think it was somebody with schizophrenia who was in, like you say, a psychotic episode. It was that murder that happened on the Greyhound bus a few years ago, where the guy decapitated somebody. Yeah. Awful. I remember after that, I used to take the bus a lot, and after that, every time I took the bus, they would search. It was almost like at the airport where they do like a bag search.
Yep.
To make sure you didn't have like a knife. So that was weird, but yeah, that happened. And yeah, Ben mentioned the mens rea, the guilty mind. He couldn't have a guilty mind like himself, if there is such an entity, because he was completely out of touch from reality when all of this happened. So it wasn't him. That was basically how the argument went. And similar arguments have been put forward in the defense of other people. Like there was a case of somebody who, I think, what did he do? He killed his mother-in-law or something while he was sleepwalking. I don't remember the name of the individual, but it's a very famous case. But somnambulism, sleepwalking. Dude was sleepwalking, straight up committed a murder, but he was sleepwalking. He wasn't conscious. So he was found not guilty. I mean, it's pretty interesting stuff. I don't know if there were witnesses. Yeah. But I think it was medically documented that he had, it's like, no, we put him in a sleep lab and he shows signs of somnambulism. So, Gazzaniga, the Italian neuroscientist, believes there's a double conscious system in split brain patients, that is. But he changed his mind. So he initially advocated this, but he discovered something he calls the interpreter in the left hemisphere. If you want to know more about this, Gazzaniga has a book called The Mind's Eye. The Mind's Eye, the letter I, the ego. It's all about the self and how the brain constructs this illusion of selfhood. So what does the interpreter do? Well, he'll do an experiment. Gazzaniga does an experiment with like a split brain patient, and maybe a chicken claw is flashed to the left hemisphere and the snowy scene is flashed to the right hemisphere. Then from an array of pictures, one of his patients, PS, points to a shovel with his left hand because, the snowy scene was presented to the right, and a chicken with his right hand because the chicken claw was presented to the left visual field. But now he's got to explain his choice. What does he say? Oh, it's simple. The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. So his verbal sender was not aware of the snowy scene presented on the right side. So he had to make up. And why am I picking the shovel? Well, I got to clean the chicken shed. That's confabulation. This happens under hypnosis too. people will make up an explanation for something that maybe I plan to suggest. Let's say I hypnotize all of you, right? And I say that when you wake up, you're going to feel really warm and you're going to want to open the window. So then I snap my fingers and you wake up and one of you gets up and opens the window. Say, how come you're opening the window? And you'll make up an excuse like, oh, it's hot in here, don't you think? Like, or I wanted to listen to the birds outside, or any number of explanations that you'll just kind of make up to explain why you're doing what you're doing.
For listening to the birds is a very valid explanation.
Yeah, it is. But imagine if imagine if that's only why you think you're doing that. When the real reason is that somebody just suggested, hey, you should open the window after this guy snaps his fingers, right? Weird. Yeah.
So you mentioned that like hypnotism is a thing that is actually possible, and what you're mentioning, is that like in the realm of subliminal messaging and stuff like that? You're trying to get somebody to build like a action reaction response to a certain set of stimuli.
Yeah. Yeah, like it's called suggestion,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
Like subliminal messaging isn't really a thing, but
Play the words backwards at the end of the Led Zeppelin.
yeah, but we can present stimuli in such a way that they'll see the reason why it doesn't work is that it's below the threshold of conscious awareness, right?
Okay.
Like we're not aware of it,
It's subliminal,
but yeah, it's subliminal. But hypnotic suggestions, yeah, it's weird. Like hypnosis is not an exact science, and it's hard to really know what's happening when someone is being hypnotized. It would moreover be unethical to hypnotize people in most circumstances anyway, because, you know, unless you're, I mean, when do we hypnotize people? Maybe in therapy, or maybe at like for entertainment purposes, right? You've seen those hypnotists that make people do all kinds of silly things, and you know, so it's hard to, I guess it's hard to do to research this because of the ethics involved, right? But there are little exercises you can do where you can see the effects of suggestion. I can come up with one and do it another time if you want to sort of see how it works for yourself. It wouldn't be like full-on hypnosis, but yeah. Where were we? Oh, still talking about the interpreter. We've got 5 minutes left. So maybe we should just wrap up on this slide. So if Gazaniga's right, what's going on here? We've got a dominant and a non-dominant hemisphere. Is the non-dominant hemisphere actually conscious? Does it have a sense of self? Well, Gazaniga thinks that in most people anyway, it's the left hemisphere that uses language, and that's where the interpreter is. So the interpreter is using language, organizing beliefs, ascribing intentions and actions to people. So he thinks that only the left hemisphere can have high-level consciousness. Sperry wonders whether this non-dominant hemisphere actually has a true stream of conscious awareness as well. Or maybe it's like a zombie. So Sperry agrees with Gazaniga. The non-dominant hemisphere may not be conscious. It could be like a zombie in your head. Just like the dorsal and ventral streams, the vision for action stream is like a zombie, in that you're not consciously aware of what's going on. If somebody tosses me a piece of paper or something, it seems to me that I'm looking at it and consciously directing my hand to catch it, but that's not what's happening. Remember, it's all actually unconscious and automatic dorsal stream stuff driving that. So each research or each hemisphere, research has shown, also possesses different abilities. And you've probably heard some, oh, Ben has a quick question. Yeah. Yes, there was a barrier. Ben is asking about the barrier between the eyes. Yeah, usually in any split brain experiment, the participants are looking at a screen and the screen is divided in two. Sometimes that's with an actual thing that goes up to your face. And sometimes it's just like, keep your eyes fixed on the center, don't look. don't let your eyes move to the right or left. So it's a little different depending on the experiment, but yeah, there is usually some kind of divider between the sides of the screen. So, you know, you've probably heard some bad pop science about this stuff, right? Left brain and right brain. Are you left-brained or right-brained? Unlock your right brain creativity with, you know, our new app or something, right? Like,
Brain is Prego, right brain is Rego.
yeah, like what the heck? It's not that simple, right? But it is true that in most people, because most people are right-handed, that their left hemisphere has superior language skills, because that's where the language centers are, right? The right has better face recognition. This is why people say that the left brain is logical and the right brain is creative. It's not really that. You know, using logic or being creative, making art or music, or doing philosophy, all of these use the entire brain, right? You know, so this left brain, right brain stuff is kind of like that 10% of your brain. It's just, come on, we use all of it. But it's true that some stuff in most people is on one side and other stuff is on the other side. Like the right hemisphere has better face recognition, but the right hemisphere's reasoning and language abilities are not very advanced. Blackmore says they're on par with a 3-year-old child or maybe a chimpanzee. But we still consider chimpanzees and infants conscious. So maybe the non-dominant hemisphere is conscious, right? And Imon online asks, would this all be the reverse for left-handed people? Yeah, as I was mentioning before, I'm right-handed, so my language centers are on my left side. But if you're left-handed, chances are your language centers are going to be on the right cerebral hemisphere. So, yeah. Let's see, I think we should wrap it up there because it's 12:55. We've made it pretty far through these slides. So it looks like on Friday, what we'll do is finish up these slides, and then we're going to talk about theories of self. It's okay that we're a little ahead on this. These slides were meant to be for both classes this week, but this next chapter, Theories of Self, has a lot of really cool thought experiments. And if the last time I did anything like this is any indication, we're going to have a really fun time talking about the results of these thought experiments that we're going to do. We're talking about teletransporters and the ship of Theseus and all this classic fun stuff. So that's what we'll start on Friday after we finish this. So yeah, thanks. It's great to be back in person, huh? Yeah, I like this. I forgot to print the attendance sheet, so I don't know if we're going to worry about attendance this week. So yeah, just don't worry about that for now.
Raise your hand if you're not here.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, don't worry, Iman. Thought experiment's going to be good. You're going to enjoy it.
I have just a quick question.
Yeah, go
So
ahead.
you mentioned the audio processing portion is in the left side of the brain, and that the left ear is connected to the left side of the brain.
Well, not audio, language.
Language, okay.
Yeah.
So if somebody was deaf in their left ear, and they were a case of split brain, would they be functionally fully deaf?
Definitely. Well, it depends where the problem is. Is it a problem in the brain, or a problem with the auditory nerve, or with the eardrum?
Let's say a burst eardrum or something.
So in that case, they should still be able to. What was the question?
They're a case of split brain and they're deaf in the left ear. Can their right ear process the audio? Because if the language processing portion is on the right side, they would just hear audio but not be able to process the language, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay.
But you'd have to
I'm
hope
just-
that they could still hear, like, even if, say, I'm deaf here and you're talking to me, maybe I can still hear a little bit, or maybe I would just have to turn and
Yeah.
reorient, you know? I'm really not sure, but that's a good question.
Because there are instances of people who suffer like traumatic brain injuries who like they have specific portions like damage, like say the language processing part of the brain where it affects like you'll have people who can like